Yukon Territory, spring 2011. A group of Boy Scouts aged 11 to 13 ventured into the wilderness for what was meant to be a 3-day educational camping expedition. Led by James Hartley, a veteran scout leader with over 15 years of wilderness survival training, the 10 boys were eager for the adventure, a chance to test their outdoor skills in one of North America's last truly wild places. James was meticulous about safety, recalled former colleague Diane Morris, her eyes distant with memory. He would spend weeks preparing for these trips, checking weather patterns, planning emergency protocols, making sure every child had redundant safety equipment. The idea that he would put those boys in danger it's unthinkable. The expedition was supposed to follow a well-established route, one that Hartley had traversed numerous times before. The path skirted the edges of more dangerous territories, designed specifically to minimize encounters with large predators while still providing an authentic wilderness experience. The boys were scheduled to return on Sunday afternoon. When 6 p.m. passed with no sign of the group and no radio contact, concerned parents gathered at the pickup point, initially calm but growing increasingly anxious as darkness fell. By midnight, with temperatures dropping and still no word from Hartley or any of the scouts, local authorities launched the first search parties. By dawn, the operation had expanded exponentially. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police mobilized their wilderness search and rescue teams. Volunteers from Whitehorse and surrounding communities formed additional search parties. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging technology scanned the dense forest canopy. Search dogs sniffed for human scent along miles of rugged terrain. Days passed with no sign of the missing group, no campsite, no equipment, no trail markers, no distress signals. The absence of any evidence was profoundly disturbing to seasoned search and rescue professionals. In my 23 years of wilderness rescue, I've never seen anything like it, said Robert Matheson, who coordinated the air search efforts. It's as if they simply vanished. Even when people don't survive in the wilderness, they leave something behind: equipment, disturbed vegetation, footprints, the absolute absence of evidence. It's not just unusual, it's practically impossible. The weather during the search proved particularly challenging. Spring in Yukon is notoriously unpredictable, and 2011 brought some of the most erratic conditions in recent memory. Late-season snowstorms alternated with heavy rainfall, creating treacherous conditions that hampered search efforts and continually erased potential evidence. Visibility was often reduced to mere feet, and search helicopters were grounded for days at a time. As the first week stretched into the second, hope began to dwindle. Survival experts consulted by the RCMP estimated that even with proper equipment and wilderness knowledge, the window for survival, particularly for the younger boys, was rapidly closing in the fluctuating sub-freezing temperatures. The story captured national attention. Canadian news networks broadcast nightly updates on the search efforts. The faces of the missing boys, Tyler Jenkins, Ethan Blackwood, Logan Mitchell, Michael Cooper, Daniel Green, Adam Wilson, Ryan Taylor, Christopher Chun, Brandon Morris, and Jacob Phillips became familiar to households across the country. Their school portraits, showing gap-toothed smiles and childhood innocence, were juxtaposed against the harsh, indifferent landscape that had swallowed them whole. 3 weeks into the search, with resources stretched thin and morale at its lowest, RCMP Commissioner William Foster faced the grim task of scaling back operations. At a press conference that would later become controversial, Foster explained the difficult decision. We remain committed to finding answers for these devastated families. But we must be realistic about our available resources and the diminishing chances of finding survivors at this point. The Department of Conservation issued a preliminary report suggesting the group had likely been caught in one of the sudden snowstorms common to the region, becoming disoriented and ultimately succumbing to the elements. The report also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the possibility of a coordinated predator attack, though it acknowledged such incidents were extremely rare. This mention of potential animal predation would later prove fateful in shaping the narrative around the disappearance. For the families, the transition from search to recovery and eventually to acceptance was agonizing. 6 months after the disappearance, with active search efforts reduced to occasional patrols, a memorial service was held at Whitehorse Elementary, where most of the boys had attended school. The gymnasium was transformed with photographs, art projects, and personal mementos of the missing scouts. The mayor's speech emphasized community healing and moving forward, a sentiment that resonated with many of the grieving families, but not all. Susan Blackwood, mother of 12-year-old Ethan, walked out of the service visibly distressed. A biology teacher at the local high school, Susan had spent the previous months immersed in wilderness survival literature and topographical maps of the search area, convinced that something about the official explanation didn't add up. "They're treating this like it's over," she told a local reporter outside the memorial. "But where's the evidence? Where are our children? I've spent my whole career teaching about empirical observation and the scientific method. You don't just accept a theory because it's convenient or comforting." Her words were largely dismissed as the understandable reaction of a grieving mother unable to accept reality. Even her husband, Mark, worried that Susan's refusal to acknowledge their son's likely death was preventing her from beginning the healing process. Their marriage, already strained by the tragedy, began to fracture under the weight of their divergent grieving styles. 1 year after the disappearance in spring 2012, the case was officially classified as inactive pending new evidence. Probable cause was listed as multiple fatalities due to exposure to the elements and/or animal predation. For most of Whitehorse, this marked the end of a painful chapter. The community had been profoundly changed by the tragedy, but life gradually returned to a new normal, albeit one shadowed by a heightened awareness of the wilderness's dangers. For 3 years, the case of Troop 437 faded from public consciousness, remembered primarily on anniversaries or when similar wilderness tragedies occurred elsewhere. Then, in late summer 2014, the story exploded back into headlines with a discovery that seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. Mark Reynolds, an experienced park ranger patrolling a remote area approximately 22 miles from the scouts' last known location, spotted a grizzly bear dragging what appeared to be camping equipment. After safely observing the animal move away from the area, Reynolds investigated and discovered 3 severely damaged sleeping bags with what appeared to be bloodstains, along with shredded backpack fragments. The items were immediately sent for forensic analysis. Despite significant degradation from years of exposure, manufacturer tags on the sleeping bags matched the exact model used by Troop 437. DNA testing confirmed the presence of human blood on 2 of the bags, subsequently identified as belonging to Ethan Blackwood and Logan Mitchell. Reynolds' body camera footage of the grizzly bear with the sleeping bags spread rapidly across national media, providing a visceral, haunting image that seemed to solve the mystery once and for all. Commissioner Foster, addressing the press with a somber expression that couldn't quite mask his relief at having the case apparently resolved, stated, "This is the closure we feared, but needed." The evidence strongly suggests the group fell victim to a bear attack, a devastating tragedy, but one that finally offers some answers to the families. The Conservation Department quickly supported this conclusion, with a detailed statement explaining that grizzly bears are known to partially bury their prey and return to them over extended periods, sometimes years, which explains why these items were only discovered now. Wildlife biologists elaborated on the statement, noting that bears emerging from hibernation are particularly dangerous, and that even large groups can be vulnerable if a bear is sufficiently hungry or feels threatened. A second memorial service was held, this time with a sense of finality. The case was officially closed, with fatal predator attack recorded as the cause of death. Media outlets produced extensive reports on Canadian wilderness dangers, with animal behavior experts explaining the rare but real risks of venturing into bear country. The image of the grizzly dragging the blood-stained sleeping bag became an iconic warning used in wilderness safety programs across North America. But in a modest home on the outskirts of Whitehorse, Susan Blackwood stared at her television screen with growing skepticism. While the rest of the world saw conclusive evidence, she saw inconsistencies that gnawed at her scientific mind. "Bears don't collect multiple sleeping bags," she murmured to herself, rewinding the news footage for the dozenth time. "They don't transport prey items miles away from the attack site. And they certainly don't wait 3 years to return to a food cache." Her husband had moved out 6 months earlier, unable to cope with what he saw as Susan's inability to accept reality. Their divorce was nearly finalized. Her relationship with colleagues had grown strained as her obsession with the case intensified. But the discovery of the sleeping bags, particularly the confirmation that one contained Ethan's blood, only strengthened her resolve. The next morning, Susan requested a meeting with Detective Marcus Brennan, the RCMP officer who had led the original investigation. Brennan agreed, more out of compassion for a grieving mother than any expectation of new insights. In his office, Susan laid out a series of photographs, the sleeping bag images from the news, enlarged and printed on high-quality paper. "Look at these tears," she said, pointing to jagged rips in the fabric. "Yes, there are irregular tears consistent with animal claws, but there are also these." Her finger moved to several straight-edged cuts in specific locations. "These are knife cuts, Detective. Clean, deliberate incisions that no bear claw could ever produce." Brennan studied the images with a practiced eye. After a long silence, he spoke carefully. "Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you're looking for a different answer. But fabric degrades in unpredictable ways after years in the wilderness. What might look like knife cuts could simply be stress tears along seam lines or, I've been a biology teacher for 15 years, Susan interrupted. I've dissected countless specimens. I know the difference between a tear and a cut. Something is wrong here, Detective. Something has been wrong from the beginning. Brennan sighed, his expression a mixture of pity and exhaustion. Susan. May I call you Susan? We've investigated every angle. We had tracking experts, wilderness guides, wildlife biologists, and over 100 trained personnel searching for weeks. If there were any signs of foul play, we would have found them. Unless someone didn't want them found, Susan replied quietly. The detective's face hardened slightly. That's quite an accusation. It's an observation, Susan corrected. One based on inconsistencies that no one seems willing to acknowledge. As she left the RCMP station, Susan knew she had failed to convince Brennan. But rather than discouraging her, the meeting crystallized her determination. If the authorities wouldn't investigate properly, she would do it herself. That evening, Susan converted her home office into an investigation center. She pinned maps to the walls, created timelines, and organized folders of information she had collected over the past 3 years. She took a leave of absence from her teaching position, a leave that would eventually become permanent when the school board, concerned about her mental health, gently but firmly suggested she resign. Susan began retracing the investigation from the beginning, looking for details that might have been overlooked or dismissed. She obtained copies of the original search and rescue reports through Freedom of Information requests. She interviewed volunteers who had participated in the search. She consulted wilderness experts about grizzly bear behavior, accumulating evidence that contradicted the official narrative. Most people in Whitehorse avoided Susan, uncomfortable with her refusal to accept what they saw as obvious truth. Some pitied her, others whispered about her declining mental state. Former friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. Parents of her students looked away when they encountered her in the grocery store. Her sister, visiting from Vancouver, gently suggested therapy and medication. But Susan found an unexpected ally in Karen Mitchell, mother of Logan, whose blood had also been found on one of the recovered sleeping bags. Unlike Susan, Karen had publicly accepted the bear attack theory, finding some measure of peace in having an explanation, no matter how tragic. But privately, she too harbored questions. I never said anything because I thought I was just ... Unable to let go, Karen confessed during their first meeting at a quiet corner table in a Whitehorse cafe. But the way you described those cuts on the sleeping bags, it's been bothering me too. And there's something else ... Karen reached into her purse and withdrew a small digital voice recorder. Logan took this on the trip. He was so proud of it. Saved his allowance for months. I couldn't bear to look at it after ... But last night, after seeing your interview on the local news, I finally found the courage. Susan took the device with trembling hands. There's a recording? Karen nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Just from the first day. Nothing unusual, just Logan being Logan. Excited about the trip, describing what they were doing. But there's a moment, just a brief comment, that doesn't make sense to me. Susan pressed play, and for the first time in 3 years, heard the voice of a young boy who had been more than just a face on a missing poster or a blood sample on a sleeping bag. Logan's voice was animated, full of the exuberance of youth as he described the campsite, the other boys, and the activities planned for their expedition. James and Miguel are teaching us how to identify animal tracks today, Logan's voice announced cheerfully. Miguel says if we learn to read the forest right, it's like having eyes in the back of our head. Susan paused the recording, her heart racing. Miguel? Who is Miguel? Karen shook her head slowly. That's just it. There was no Miguel on that trip. The official roster listed only James Hartley as the adult supervisor. I checked it a dozen times. The two women stared at each other, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. After a moment of stunned silence, Susan rewound the recording and played it again. There was no mistaking the words. James and Miguel, an unidentified adult, had been with their children on that fateful expedition. A man whose presence had never been acknowledged in any official report. A man whose very existence had been erased from the narrative. For Susan, this wasn't just a new clue, it was validation of her deepest suspicions. The disappearance of Troop 437 had never been a simple wilderness tragedy or animal attack. Something far more deliberate and potentially far more sinister had occurred in those remote Yukon forests. As she left the cafe, recorder clutched tightly in her hand, Susan knew that the real investigation was just beginning. Somewhere beyond the convenient narrative of wilderness dangers and animal predation lay a truth that someone had gone to great lengths to conceal. And no matter the personal cost, she was determined to uncover it. What she couldn't yet know was just how high that cost would be, or how deep the conspiracy stretched beyond the silent, snow-covered forests of Yukon territory. The revelation of Miguel's existence transformed Susan's investigation. What had been intuition and vague suspicion crystallized into something tangible, an undocumented adult present during her son's final known days. For the first time since the disappearance, she had concrete evidence that the official record was incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. Susan and Karen immediately brought Logan's recording to Detective Brennan. The veteran officer's initial skepticism visibly wavered as he listened to the child's voice clearly mentioning James and Miguel. He rewound the tape several times, his expression growing increasingly troubled. This changes things, he finally admitted, setting the recorder down carefully. An unidentified adult with the group. Why wasn't this in any report? He pulled the case file from his cabinet, flipping through the pages with renewed attention. The official roster listed only Hartley as supervision. 10 scouts, 1 leader. That was the information we based the entire search on. For Susan, the detective's reaction validated years of suspicion. We need to find out who Miguel is. He could be the key to everything. The investigation into Miguel's identity began with the records of the local Scout Council. Karen accessed her late husband's email archives. He had served as Troop 437's committee chair before his death from cancer in 2012. She discovered communications between James Hartley and council leadership discussing a potential assistant for the Yukon expedition. One email mentioned a volunteer with wilderness experience who might join, but no name was provided. Susan traced Hartley's movements in the weeks before the expedition. The scout leader had made several trips to a neighboring town, ostensibly for supply purchases. Credit card records showed a meal purchased at a restaurant there, 2 entrees, suggesting he hadn't dined alone. The restaurant, a small family-owned establishment called Denali's, had security cameras, but the footage from 2011 had long since been overwritten. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lily Chun, mother of Christopher, one of the missing scouts, had preserved every memento of her son's scouting experience. Among these was a group photo taken during a troop meeting 2 weeks before the fateful expedition. In the background, partially obscured but definitely present, stood a man who wasn't James Hartley, a lean, dark-haired individual conversing with the scout leader. "I never noticed him before," Lily said softly, handing the photograph to Susan. "He wasn't involved with the troop regularly, so I just didn't see him." The photo was too blurry for facial recognition, but it provided the first visual evidence of a potential Miguel. Susan had it professionally enhanced, resulting in a grainy but discernible image of a man in his 30s with distinctive features that suggested Latin American heritage. Brennan, increasingly invested in the reopened investigation, circulated the enhanced image among RCMP colleagues and Border Patrol officers. "If this man crossed into Canada legally, there should be a record," he reasoned. While waiting for results from official channels, Susan pursued another angle. Richard Tanner, the local guide who had helped plan the troops' route, might have known about any last-minute additions to the expedition. Locating Tanner proved unexpectedly difficult. He had apparently left Yukon shortly after the disappearance, citing a family emergency in Arizona. Susan's calls to Arizona turned up no relatives with Tanner's surname. His former employer, Yukon Wilderness Expeditions, had minimal information, just an emergency contact form listing a cousin in Phoenix. When Susan finally tracked down the cousin, she learned Tanner had never arrived in Arizona. "Richard? I haven't seen him in years," the cousin said, sounding genuinely confused. "He called once saying he was coming to stay for a while, but he never showed up. I figured he changed his mind." This disappearance immediately after the scouts' vanishing raised red flags. Susan compiled Tanner's known information, driver's license, passport number, employment history, and forwarded it to Brennan, who ran it through law enforcement databases. The results were disturbing. 3 months after the scouts disappeared, Richard Tanner had died in a single-vehicle accident near the Mexico border. The circumstances were suspicious. No mechanical failure, no adverse weather conditions, no alcohol in his system, just an inexplicable drive off a desert cliff. The case had been investigated by local authorities but ultimately ruled accidental. "People don't just drive off cliffs," Susan insisted when Brennan shared the report. "And they don't disappear right after helping plan a trip where 11 people vanish." Brennan nodded slowly. "I'm starting to think you've been right all along, Mrs. Blackwood." The investigation intensified. Brennan, approaching retirement and increasingly troubled by the case's inconsistencies, dedicated his remaining professional resources to pursuing leads that had been previously overlooked. He re-interviewed search volunteers, focusing on any mention of evidence that might have been dismissed under the animal attack theory. One such volunteer, a wilderness guide named Thomas Blackfeather, recalled finding an unusual tire track pattern approximately 7 miles from the scouts' planned route. "It wasn't from any search vehicle. We logged all those," he explained. It looked like something heavy had been driven off trail, which is nearly impossible in that terrain without specialized equipment. I reported it, but was told it was probably from forestry workers months earlier. The location of these tracks was particularly significant. They were found in an area that hadn't been thoroughly searched due to its distance from the planned route. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and suspicion, this remote area took on new importance. Brennan arranged for a new search of the location, but 3 years of Yukon weather had erased any physical evidence. However, satellite imagery from 2011, obtained through federal law enforcement channels, showed what appeared to be a vehicle-sized disturbance in the vegetation during the relevant time frame. While these investigations proceeded, Susan continued examining the recovered sleeping bags. The forensics report had focused primarily on confirming the blood DNA matches to Ethan and Logan, not on analyzing the nature of the damage to the fabric. Susan consulted Dr. Eleanor Wright, a materials analysis expert at Yukon University. "These incisions are unquestionably made with a blade," Dr. Wright confirmed after examining the bags. The cut patterns show directionality and uniformity inconsistent with animal claws or environmental degradation. Someone deliberately slashed these bags and then subjected them to further damage, perhaps to obscure the original cuts. The expert's assessment provided scientific validation for Susan's suspicions. More importantly, it directly contradicted the official narrative of a bear attack. The sleeping bags hadn't been torn by animal claws, they had been deliberately cut, then later damaged further to create the appearance of predation. This revelation fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. The disappearance of Troop 437 could no longer be classified as a wilderness tragedy or animal attack. The evidence now pointed unequivocally toward human involvement and deliberate deception. Brennan officially reopened the case. The RCMP established a task force focused on identifying Miguel and determining his connection to Richard Tanner. Border crossing records from 20102-011 were scrutinized for anyone matching the description from the enhanced photograph. After weeks of painstaking research, they identified a potential match, Miguel Ortiz, a Mexican national who had entered Canada on a temporary work visa in January 2011, 3 months before the scout's disappearance. His visa application listed wilderness guide as his occupation and included references from tour companies in Mexico and the southwestern United States. These references, when investigated, proved suspiciously thin. The Mexican company existed only on paper, with no physical address or verifiable operations. The U.S. reference was slightly more substantial, a small outfitter in Arizona that had indeed employed an M. Ortiz for a brief period, though the owner couldn't recall many details about him. Most significantly, there was no record of Miguel Ortiz leaving Canada after the scout's disappearance. His temporary visa had expired in June 2011, but no exit documentation existed. He had effectively vanished, just like Richard Tanner. Just like Troop 437, the connection between Ortiz and Tanner remained elusive until Karen discovered something in Logan's belongings, a small notebook containing his characteristic childish handwriting. Most entries were typical of a 12-year-old boy. Observations about friends, complaints about school, excitement about the upcoming camping trip. But one entry, dated just 2 days before the expedition, contained a crucial detail. Mr. Tanner brought his friend Miguel to our meeting today. Miguel is from Mexico and knows everything about animals. He's going to come on the trip to help Mr. Hartley. He showed us pictures of jaguars from when he was a guide in the jungle. So cool! This single paragraph connected all 3 men, Hartley, Tanner, and Ortiz, and placed them together just before the expedition. It also suggested Tanner had been instrumental in introducing Ortiz to the group. Armed with this information, Brennan expanded the investigation to include Richard Tanner's background. The deeper they dug, the more troubling the picture became. 5 years before the Scout's disappearance, Tanner had been investigated in connection with wildlife smuggling operations between Canada and Mexico. Though never charged due to insufficient evidence, he had remained on conservation officers' radar. Bank records showed irregular deposits into Tanner's account in the months leading up to the expedition, sums between $5,000 and $10,000 appearing approximately every 6 weeks from untraceable sources. His modest guiding business couldn't explain this income. In the 2 weeks after the Scout's disappearance, Tanner had emptied his accounts and converted nearly $40,000 to cash before leaving Yukon. The investigation now faced a critical question. If Tanner and Ortiz had been involved in the disappearance, what was their motive? The wilderness smuggling angle offered one possibility. Perhaps the Scouts had accidentally witnessed something they shouldn't have. But the elaborate nature of the disappearance, the careful staging of evidence to suggest an animal attack, and the significant financial transactions pointed to something more calculated than an impromptu silencing of witnesses. Susan, increasingly convinced that her son and the other Scouts might still be alive, mortgaged her house to fund a private investigation supplementing the official efforts. She hired Alan Ramirez, a former FBI agent specializing in cross-border crimes, to pursue leads in Mexico while she continued working with Brennan in Canada. Ramirez's initial reports were discouraging. The trail had gone cold years ago, and Miguel Ortiz was a common enough name in Mexico to make identification difficult without more specific information. But as he delved into smuggling networks operating between Yukon and northern Mexico, Ramirez began hearing whispers about El Trabio de los Exploradores, the job involving the Scouts. These aren't the kind of people who keep records or talk openly, Ramirez cautioned during a video call with Susan and Brennan. But there's definitely recognition of the incident in certain circles. I'm hearing it described as work that went wrong, or the complicated job. No specifics yet, but enough to confirm we're on the right track. Meanwhile, Commissioner Foster, who had overseen the original investigation and officially closed the case after the sleeping bag discovery, reacted defensively to the reopened investigation. In a tense meeting with Brennan, he questioned the allocation of resources to a settled case and suggested that pursuing conspiracy theories would only re-traumatize the community. With all due respect, sir, Brennan responded, we have concrete evidence of an unidentified adult with the group, deliberate tampering with evidence, and connections to known smuggling operations. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's criminal investigation. Foster's opposition raised questions about his handling of the original case. Had he simply been following standard procedures in attributing the disappearance to wilderness dangers, or had there been pressure to wrap up the investigation quickly? More troublingly, had he deliberately ignored evidence that contradicted the animal attack narrative? Susan began researching Foster's career and connections, discovering that he had served on a joint task force with U.S. Border Patrol in the years before being appointed commissioner. During this time, he had worked extensively in the same regions where Richard Tanner had been investigated for smuggling activities. Though no direct connection emerged, the coincidence was difficult to ignore. The investigation suffered a setback when Brennan reached mandatory retirement age. His replacement, Inspector Sharma, was competent but lacked Brennan's personal investment in the case. Sharma approached the evidence methodically but maintained professional distance, viewing it as one case among many rather than the consuming focus it had been for Brennan. Susan felt the loss of her strongest ally within law enforcement keenly. At Brennan's retirement gathering, he took her aside and spoke quietly but urgently. "Don't give up," he said, his voice low. "I couldn't get to the bottom of this before they pushed me out, but I'm not walking away. I'll keep working this unofficially. There's something big here, something people in positions of power don't want uncovered." Brennan's words proved prophetic. Within weeks of his retirement, Susan noticed signs of surveillance, unmarked vehicles parked near her home, clicks on her phone line, evidence of her email being accessed remotely. When she reported these concerns to Inspector Sharma, she was met with polite skepticism and suggestions that stress might be affecting her perception. Undeterred, Susan continued her investigation, now with both official and unofficial support. Brennan, freed from departmental constraints, pursued leads that would have been deemed too speculative or resource-intensive within the RCMP framework. His decades of law enforcement connections provided access to information that might otherwise have remained hidden. One such connection led to a crucial discovery. A former Border Patrol agent who had worked with Foster provided Brennan with records of communication between Canadian and Mexican authorities in the months following the scout's disappearance. These communications, marked confidential, contained references to potential trafficking concerns related to the case, a line of inquiry that had never been mentioned in any public or internal reports. They knew, Brennan told Susan, his voice tight with controlled anger. They knew from the beginning that this might involve human trafficking, and they buried it. The question is why? The human trafficking angle shifted the investigation's focus dramatically. If the scouts hadn't been killed in the wilderness but had instead been taken across borders, there was a possibility, however remote after 5 years, that they might still be alive. This hope fueled Susan's determination, but it also made her a more significant threat to whoever had orchestrated the disappearance. The surveillance intensified. Anonymous calls came in the night. Her home was broken into, though nothing of value was taken, only her case notes and timeline were disturbed. Rather than intimidating her, these attempts at harassment only convinced Susan that she was getting closer to the truth. She moved her most important documents to a secure location and began varying her routines, making it harder to predict her movements or access her information. Ramirez's investigation in Mexico gained momentum when he identified a criminal organization specializing in cross-border trafficking, not just of wildlife or drugs, but of people. This group, operating under the cover of legitimate tour companies, had connections to officials on both sides of the border. More significantly, financial records showed payments from shell companies associated with this organization to accounts linked to Richard Tanner. The operation's sophistication explained many aspects of the scout's disappearance: the complete absence of evidence, the carefully staged animal attack, the coordinated misinformation. This wasn't the work of opportunistic criminals. It was a meticulously planned operation by professionals who specialized in making people vanish. But the motive remained elusive. Why target a group of Boy Scouts? The organization's usual trafficking operations involved economic migrants seeking illegal entry into Canada or the United States. People who had paid for the service and were willing participants, however desperate their circumstances. Abducting children from middle-class Canadian families didn't fit their established pattern. Susan theorized that the scouts might have been targeted for a specific client or purpose, perhaps international adoption black markets or labor trafficking. The boys' ages, appearances, and backgrounds might have made them valuable commodities in certain illicit markets. This theory gained credibility when Ramirez discovered a pattern of similar disappearances in remote areas across North America. Small groups of children or teenagers vanishing in wilderness settings. Their disappearances invariably attributed to environmental dangers or animal attacks. None had the high profile of Troop 437, but collectively they suggested an operation that had been functioning successfully for years by exploiting the inherent dangers of wilderness environments as cover. As the investigation approached the 5-year mark since the disappearance, Susan received an unexpected communication, an anonymous email containing only geographical coordinates and the message, "Not all survive the transfer. Some questions are better left unasked." The coordinates led to a remote location in northern Mexico, an area known for cartel activity and seldom visited by law enforcement. Susan immediately forwarded the information to Ramirez, who approached trusted contacts in Mexican federal police for assistance. What they discovered at the location would shatter the foundation of the official narrative and confirm Susan's most terrible suspicions. In an abandoned structure once used for livestock, forensic teams uncovered evidence of human habitation and human suffering. Among the items recovered were a tattered Boy Scout uniform patch bearing Troop 437's insignia and a wallet containing James Hartley's degraded but still identifiable driver's license. DNA testing of blood samples from the site confirmed the presence of James Hartley's blood in significant quantities, suggesting he had been seriously injured or killed there. More disturbing was the confirmation of blood from two of the scouts, Ryan Taylor and Christopher Chun, though in smaller amounts consistent with injuries rather than fatal wounds. The evidence indicated that at least some members of Troop 437 had been transported to this location in Mexico. James Hartley had likely been killed there, while at least two of the scouts had been injured but potentially survived. The fate of the other 8 boys, including Ethan, remained unknown. This discovery transformed the case from a historical mystery to an urgent rescue operation. With concrete evidence of international trafficking, federal authorities in both Canada and the United States became officially involved. The FBI assigned a special task force to work with Mexican authorities, and Interpol issued notices for Miguel Ortiz and others identified through Ramirez's investigation. For Susan, the confirmation that her son might still be alive, somewhere somehow, brought both hope and heightened anguish. Every day that passed was another day Ethan lived in captivity or worse. The elaborate deception involving the sleeping bags and staged animal attack now appeared particularly cruel, a deliberate misdirection designed to terminate the search and allow the trafficking operation to proceed unhindered. Commissioner Foster was placed on administrative leave pending investigation into his handling of the case. Though no direct evidence linked him to the trafficking operation, serious questions arose about his failure to pursue obvious leads and his active discouragement of alternative theories. Whether his actions stemmed from incompetence, external pressure, or complicity remained to be determined. Susan, who had sacrificed her career, marriage, financial security, and reputation in her relentless pursuit of the truth, found herself suddenly validated but still far from the resolution she sought. The mystery of what had happened to Troop 437 was partially solved, but the more important question, where were the boys now, remained unanswered. As international law enforcement mobilized, Susan received another anonymous communication. This time a phone call from a voice disguised by electronic distortion. The children who survived were separated, the voice informed her. New identities, new families, new countries. Some were sold for adoption, others for labor. They won't remember their past lives now. The process is very effective. Who is this? Susan demanded. How do you know these things? The voice continued as if she hadn't spoken. Your son was among those who survived the initial transport. He was considered high-value merchandise, healthy, intelligent, photogenic. The type that wealthy childless couples pay premium prices for. The call ended abruptly, leaving Susan with the first confirmation that Ethan might still be alive and the horrifying context of his current existence. The merchandise terminology revealed the dehumanizing reality of whatever organization had taken the boys. When traced, the call proved to have been routed through multiple countries using sophisticated encryption technology. The level of technical expertise involved further confirmed the operation's professional nature and substantial resources. As the investigation expanded internationally, Susan prepared for what might be the most difficult phase of her 5-year journey. Search for children who might no longer remember being Ethan Blackwood, Logan Mitchell, or any of the other scouts of Troop 437. Children who might now be teenagers living under different names, speaking different languages, with no memory of their life before the Yukon wilderness swallowed them and the world believed they had fallen victim to the savage whims of nature. The wilderness had indeed claimed victims that spring day in 2011, but the predators weren't bears or wolves. They were humans who had weaponized the wild, using its inherent dangers as the perfect cover for something far more calculated and cruel than any act of natural predation could ever be. The international investigation into Troop 437's disappearance entered uncharted territory. No precedent existed for recovering children potentially trafficked years earlier. Their identities erased and their memories of their former lives systematically suppressed. The task force assembled to address this unprecedented case included specialists in international child abduction, trafficking networks, memory recovery, and trauma psychology. Susan found herself in Mexico City, working alongside Alan Ramirez and a team of international law enforcement officers. The abandoned structure where James Hartley's blood had been found yielded additional evidence under intensive forensic examination. Beneath floorboards, investigators discovered a cache of documents, water-damaged but partially legible, including transport schedules, rudimentary medical assessments of the boys, and coded communications regarding their processing and placement. These documents provided the first concrete timeline of what had happened after the abduction. The scouts had apparently been transported across the Canadian border in separate vehicles, using remote crossing points known to smugglers but rarely patrolled by authorities. The journey to Mexico had taken approximately 5 days, during which the boys were kept sedated to prevent escape attempts or noise. Most disturbing were medical notations indicating the administration of drugs designed to induce memory disruption, pharmaceuticals typically used for general anesthesia, but applied in specific patterns to target the formation and retention of long-term memories. This explained how children as old as 11 to 13 could potentially forget their previous identities. They had been subjected to chemical memory suppression reinforced by psychological conditioning. The discovery of these documents coincided with a breakthrough in identifying Miguel Ortiz. Facial recognition software, running the enhanced photo from the scout meeting against immigration databases across North America, returned a match from a border crossing in Texas 3 months after the scout's disappearance. The man had been traveling under the name Gabriel Mendez, but his biometric measurements matched those of Miguel Ortiz. Further investigation revealed Gabriel Mendez had established residence in a small town near Monterrey, Mexico. Surveillance confirmed his presence there, now operating a seemingly legitimate tour company specializing in adventure expeditions for wealthy foreign tourists. The business appeared to be a perfect cover for someone with knowledge of remote wilderness areas and cross-border trafficking routes. Mexican federal police placed Ortiz under surveillance while international arrest warrants were prepared. The operation required careful coordination. Moving too quickly risked alerting other members of the trafficking network who might still have access to the missing boys. Moving too slowly risked Ortiz disappearing again. Susan, though not officially part of the operation, remained in Mexico City, receiving daily briefings and providing insights based on her years of independent investigation. Her persistence had transformed her from a grieving mother into something approaching an expert on this particular trafficking network. Her perspective valued by seasoned law enforcement professionals who had initially dismissed her theories. The surveillance of Ortiz yielded an unexpected development. He was observed meeting with a young man approximately 17 to 18 years old whose physical characteristics bore striking similarities to Christopher Chun, one of the missing scouts. The young man, however, spoke fluent Spanish without accent and appeared to be fully integrated into local society as Ortiz's assistant or protege. This observation raised complex questions. If this was indeed Christopher Chun, Had he been co-opted into the very organization that had abducted him? Was he a victim, a collaborator, or something in between? And if he had been successfully reprogrammed to forget his former identity, what ethical challenges would be involved in forcibly reintroducing his past? These questions became academic when Ortiz, perhaps sensing the surveillance, attempted to flee. Mexican federal police intercepted him at a private airfield where a small plane had been prepared for immediate departure. The young man believed to be Christopher Chun was not with him at the time of arrest. In custody, Ortiz initially maintained his Gabriel Mendez identity, presenting seemingly legitimate documentation and expressing outrage at his detention. When confronted with evidence connecting him to the scout's disappearance, he demanded legal representation and refused further cooperation. The breakthrough came not through interrogation but through an unexpected source. Karen Mitchell, who had traveled to Mexico at Susan's urging, was permitted to observe Ortiz through one-way glass. Though physically separated, her presence seemed to trigger something in the detained man. Witnesses described him becoming agitated, repeatedly glancing toward the observation window despite not being able to see through it. "He knows I'm here," Karen said quietly. Somehow he knows. This apparent sensitivity to Karen's presence led investigators to try an unorthodox approach. They placed personal items belonging to the missing scouts, items that had never been packed for the Keys camping trip and thus remained with their families, in the interrogation room. A baseball glove belonging to Tyler Jenkins, Brandon Morris's prized rock collection, and most significantly, a handwritten journal kept by Logan Mitchell, Karen's son. When Ortiz entered the room and saw these items, his composure visibly fractured. He refused to touch or acknowledge them directly, but his eyes repeatedly returned to Logan's journal, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "You know what these are," the interrogator said simply. It wasn't a question. After a long silence, Ortiz spoke softly in accented English. "Some survived. Not all. Not the leader. He was ... problematic." This initial crack in Ortiz's defense led to a calculated plea agreement. In exchange for information helping to locate the surviving boys and reduced sentences in a North American prison rather than a Mexican one, Ortiz agreed to provide a complete account of the operation. His confession, recorded over 3 days of intensive interviews, revealed a trafficking network more extensive and sophisticated than investigators had imagined. The organization specialized in providing children to wealthy clients throughout Latin America and beyond, clients willing to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars for children with specific characteristics, particularly fair-skinned, healthy, educated children who could be passed off as the biological offspring of affluent families. The Scouts of Troop 437 had represented an irresistible opportunity, a pre-selected group of boys from good families, all in excellent health, already gathered together in a remote location. The wilderness setting provided perfect cover for their disappearance, with natural dangers offering a plausible explanation that would eventually terminate search efforts. According to Ortiz, Richard Tanner had been the operation's initiator. Having worked legitimate wilderness expeditions for years, Tanner had connections to both the scouting organization and the trafficking network. He had identified the opportunity and brought it to his contacts in the trafficking organization, who assigned Ortiz to assist with the abduction. The original plan had not involved violence. The boys were to be separated from James Hartley through deception, loaded into vehicles under the pretense of emergency evacuation due to an approaching storm, and transported across the border before anyone realized they were missing. Hartley was to be temporarily incapacitated and left in the wilderness with altered equipment suggesting animal damage, eventually to be found alive but unable to provide clear details due to exposure and trauma. This plan collapsed when Hartley became suspicious of Ortiz's presence and behavior. The scout leader had apparently overheard a phone conversation between Ortiz and other members of the trafficking team, realizing the danger to his charges. Hartley had attempted to lead the boys away from the campsite in the night, contacting emergency services via radio. This escape attempt led to a confrontation during which Hartley was severely beaten and the boys were forcibly subdued. The radio was destroyed before any coherent distress call could be completed. Hartley's resistance transformed what was supposed to be a nonviolent abduction into something much darker. He wouldn't stop fighting, Ortiz recounted, his voice devoid of emotion. Even when we had the boys in the vehicles, he kept trying. He was determined. Hartley was transported with the boys to Mexico, where he continued attempting to protect them and facilitate their escape. These efforts eventually led to his execution at the border facility, where his blood was later discovered. According to Ortiz, Hartley's final act had been to memorize the names of the contacts and destinations planned for each boy, repeating them to the children until they could recite them, a desperate attempt to preserve some connection to their true identities. Of the 10 scouts, Ortiz claimed that 7 had survived the journey and subsequent processing. Ryan Taylor and Adam Wilson had died from apparent adverse reactions to the sedatives used during transport. Christopher Chun had attempted escape alongside James Hartley and been severely injured, though he had survived and, ironically, been kept within the organization rather than placed with a family, his knowledge of the operation making him too risky to place but too valuable to eliminate. The surviving boys had been distributed to wealthy families throughout Mexico, Guatemala, and as far south as Argentina. The families had paid between $200,000 and $350,000 per child, believing they were adopting orphans through an exclusive private network that circumvented normal adoption restrictions. Many of these families were described as loving and well-intentioned. Unaware of the criminal origins of their adoptions, they had sought to provide good homes but had been willing to bypass legal channels due to age restrictions, single-parent status, or other factors that limited their access to legitimate adoption. The boys had been subjected to intensive reprogramming, a combination of pharmaceutical memory suppression, psychological conditioning, language immersion, and the creation of false memories. Their ages had worked against complete identity erasure. Ortiz admitted that some had required more extensive treatment than others, with varying degrees of success. Most significantly for Susan, Ortiz confirmed that Ethan Blackwood had been among the survivors. He had been placed with a family in Guatemala City, a wealthy surgeon and his wife who had been unable to have children of their own. They had renamed him Eduardo Vasquez and raised him as their only son, apparently with genuine affection despite the criminal circumstances of his acquisition. This information set in motion the most delicate phase of the investigation. Internationally coordinated raids identified and arrested key members of the trafficking network across 3 countries. Simultaneously, efforts began to locate and assess the surviving boys, now young men of 18 to 20 years old. Without traumatizing them or the families who had raised them, many unaware of their children's true origins. The case presented unprecedented legal and ethical challenges. These young men had spent their formative teenage years with families who, regardless of how they had acquired them, had in many cases provided loving homes. Some had no conscious memory of their previous lives. Simply extracting them and returning them to Canada risked inflicting fresh trauma on already victimized individuals. Susan, confronted with the complex reality of potentially meeting a son who might not remember her, worked with psychologists specializing in recovered memories and identity trauma. She prepared herself for the possibility that Ethan, now Eduardo, might reject her, might have no connection to his past, might be a fundamentally different person than the 12-year-old boy who had disappeared into the Yukon wilderness. The approach to each recovered scout was tailored to their specific circumstances. In cases where adoptive families had been knowing participants in the criminal enterprise, the young men were removed immediately and provided with intensive support. In cases where families appeared genuinely unaware of the criminal background, a more graduated approach was implemented, with trained professionals carefully introducing the truth while maintaining stability. For Susan, the journey to Guatemala marked the culmination of 7 years of unrelenting pursuit. The elegant home in an exclusive Guatemala City neighborhood seemed worlds away from the rugged Yukon wilderness where her quest had begun. The young man who greeted her, tall, handsome, with Ethan's eyes but a stranger's expressions, spoke Spanish and halting English with a distinct Latin American accent. Eduardo Vasquez had been told that a Canadian woman believed he might be her long-lost son. He had agreed to the meeting out of curiosity, perhaps compassion, but with open skepticism. The parents who had raised him, now under investigation but not yet charged, had encouraged the meeting while maintaining that Eduardo was their biological child. Susan had brought photographs, Ethan's favorite childhood book, recordings of family gatherings, tangible connections to a past Eduardo didn't remember. Their initial conversations were awkward, the weight of expectations and possibilities hanging between them. On the second day of their carefully supervised visits, Susan showed Eduardo a small maple wood box. "You made this in woodshop class 3 months before you disappeared," she explained softly. "You were so proud because you'd carved the design yourself." Eduardo studied the box with detached interest, running his fingers over the somewhat crude but carefully executed design, a compass rose with elaborate directional points. "You told me you chose a compass because you never wanted to be lost," Susan continued, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "You had this fear of getting lost in the woods, which was ironic because you loved camping so much." Something flickered in Eduardo's expression, not recognition. "Exactly, but a momentary disruption in his practiced politeness." He opened the box and inside found a collection of small objects: a smooth river stone, a Canadian $1 coin, a tiny carved wooden bear, and a folded piece of paper. "These were your treasures," Susan explained. "You collected them over the course of a year. The note inside the paper is a list you made, things you wanted to do before you turned 30. Eduardo unfolded the paper slowly, revealing a child's handwriting listing ambitions both mundane and grand. Learn to snowboard, see the northern lights, climb a mountain, build a real fort, get a dog. As he stared at the list, Eduardo's hand began to tremble slightly. He set the paper down carefully and closed the box. "I have dreams sometimes," he said quietly, his first voluntary contribution to their conversations. "Of snow, so much snow, and lights in the sky. I've never seen snow in person, not really, but in my dreams I know exactly how it feels. Cold, but not unpleasant, familiar." This small moment marked the beginning of Eduardo Ethan's complex journey of rediscovery. Medical examinations later confirmed his identity through DNA matching, and psychological evaluations revealed evidence of memory suppression consistent with Ortiz's description of the trafficking operations methods. The reunion of the surviving scouts with their original families unfolded gradually over the following year. Each case presented unique challenges and outcomes. Logan Mitchell retained more substantial memories than the others, perhaps due to his strong emotional attachment to specific experiences. Brandon Morris initially rejected his Canadian identity entirely, requiring months of gentle therapy before becoming receptive to exploring his past. Jacob Phillips had developed such severe dissociative responses to memory triggers that specialists advised against forcible reintegration, focusing instead on his current psychological well-being. Christopher Chun, located working within Ortiz's tour company, presented perhaps the most complex case. Unlike the others, he had never fully lost his original memories but had adapted to survive within the criminal organization that had taken him. his compartmentalized existence, preserving his true identity privately while publicly performing his assigned role, had enabled his survival but created profound psychological divisions that would require years of specialized treatment. The legal aftermath extended far beyond the immediate trafficking network. Commissioner Foster was investigated for criminal negligence and obstruction of justice. While direct complicity in the trafficking operation couldn't be proven, evidence emerged that he had deliberately suppressed leads pointing to human involvement, apparently due to pressure from unnamed political figures with connections to business interests along the border. Foster eventually pleaded guilty to reduce charges, his reputation and career destroyed. Richard Tanner's fatal car accident was reopened as a probable homicide, with evidence suggesting the trafficking organization had eliminated him as a liability after the operation attracted more attention than anticipated. 4 senior members of the organization were ultimately identified and prosecuted, receiving sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment for charges including kidnapping, trafficking, and in James Hartley's case, murder. For the families of Ryan Taylor, Adam Wilson, and James Hartley, the resolution brought the painful closure of confirmed deaths, but also recognition of the courage shown by Hartley in his efforts to protect the boys. Hartley was posthumously awarded Canada's Cross of Valor for his sacrifice, and a wilderness safety program was established in his name to train outdoor leaders in recognition and response to human threats as well as environmental dangers. The recovered sleeping bags and staged evidence took on new significance as the deliberate nature of the deception was revealed. The wilderness itself was recast in the narrative, not as a threatening environment that had claimed young lives, but as an unwitting accomplice in a human crime, its inherent dangers weaponized to serve as the perfect cover. Eduardo Vasquez's journey toward reclaiming Ethan Blackwood's identity progressed in halting, non-linear fashion. Memories returned in fragments, sensory impressions, emotional responses, disconnected images. The process was complicated by his attachment to the family that had raised him, regardless of how they had acquired him. His adoptive parents, upon learning the full truth of his origins, cooperated with authorities in exchange for leniency, providing valuable information about the broader adoption network. Susan, who had defined herself for so long by her quest for truth, faced the challenge of redefining her relationship with a son who was simultaneously familiar and a stranger. The single-minded determination that had sustained her through 7 years of investigation and rejection gave way to a more nuanced, patient approach to rebuilding a connection that honored both who Ethan had been and who Eduardo had become. "He's not the same boy who left on that camping trip," she explained in a rare media interview after declining numerous book and film offers, "and I'm not the same mother. We're both learning who we are now and how we fit into each other's lives. Some days there's a flash of recognition so strong it takes my breath away. Other days we're just two people trying to find common ground. Both realities are true simultaneously." The legal status of the recovered scouts presented unprecedented questions in international law. Though technically victims of abduction, many had established lives in their new countries, educational records, friendships, romantic relationships, all under identities that, while fraudulently created, had become genuinely theirs. The solution ultimately emerged as a unique dual citizenship arrangement, allowing them to legally exist in both their original and acquired identities while they worked through the psychological process of integration. 2 years after the first recoveries, a private gathering brought together the survivors and their families, both Canadian and Latin American, at a neutral location in Mexico City. The meeting, close to media and facilitated by trauma specialists, allowed for conversations impossible in any other context. Adoptive parents who had unwittingly raised abducted children met the biological parents whose loss had facilitated their families. The young men themselves, straddling multiple identities and loyalties, found solidarity in their shared experience of an ordeal that defied conventional understanding. For Eduardo Ethan, the gathering provided a crucial perspective. Observing others navigating the same impossible terrain helped him articulate his own experience. In a private moment with Susan, he expressed what would become his guiding philosophy in integrating his fragmented past. "I think perhaps I am not required to choose," he said in his still accented English. Eduardo is not a fiction. He exists. He has lived and loved and learned. Ethan is not erased. He survived in dreams and instincts and unexplained familiarity with things I shouldn't know. Perhaps they are both me, just as both you and my mother in Guatemala are family. Susan's organization, initially founded to find her son, evolved to address the broader issues revealed by the case. Truth Beyond Wilderness expanded its mission to identify similar cases where wilderness disappearances might conceal human trafficking, and to advocate for more sophisticated investigation protocols that wouldn't default to animal attack or environmental danger explanations without thorough examination of all possibilities. The case of Troop 437 transformed how wilderness disappearances were investigated across North America and beyond. Law enforcement agencies developed new protocols for distinguishing between genuine wilderness tragedies and potentially staged scenes. The convenient narrative of nature's dangers claiming unprepared humans would no longer serve as an unquestioned explanation when evidence suggested more complex possibilities. The wilderness itself, the vast, majestic, indifferent landscapes of Yukon territory, remained unchanged by the human drama that had unfolded within its boundaries. The forest still harbored grizzly bears and wolves. The weather still turned with merciless unpredictability. The northern lights still danced across winter skies. But for those who understood what had truly happened to Troop 437, the wilderness had lost its power as the presumed culprit in their disappearance. The final revelation came not through investigation or confession, but through Eduardo Ethan's gradually recovering memory. During a therapeutic visit to Yukon, his first return to the territory since the abduction, he experienced a breakthrough while standing in a clearing not far from the original campsite. "It wasn't the wilderness that took us," he said, his eyes focused on something distant and invisible to others. "The wilderness tried to speak for us, but no one was listening. The broken branches weren't from animals. They were from us trying to leave signs. The disturbed ground wasn't from predators. It was from us being dragged to the vehicles." He knelt, touching the earth with a familiarity that transcended his conscious memory. "The wilderness knows what happened here. It witnessed everything. It just couldn't tell our story in a language anyone understood." This perspective, the wilderness as silent witness rather than instrument of harm, offered a profound reframing of the narrative that had defined the case for so many years. The final tragedy wasn't that nature had claimed young lives, but that human predators had so effectively exploited our readiness to blame the wild for what humans had done. In the years that followed, Eduardo established a life that honored both his past and present. He maintained relationships with both his Canadian and Guatemalan families, completed degrees in psychology and wilderness therapy, and eventually founded a program for survivors of trauma and dissociative identity experiences. His work with other recovered trafficking victims became internationally recognized for its innovative approaches to memory integration and identity reconciliation. Susan Blackwood never returned to teaching biology, but found her calling in advocacy and investigation. Her expertise in recognizing the signs of staged wilderness disappearances led to the resolution of several cold cases and the prevention of others. Though her single-minded quest had cost her marriage, career, and financial security, she expressed no regrets. "The wilderness taught me its most important lesson," she reflected on the 10th anniversary of the abduction. "In nature, nothing truly disappears. it only transforms. What looks like an ending is often just a change of state, visible to those who know how to see it. My son transformed rather than vanished. The truth transformed rather than disappeared. And perhaps I transformed too, becoming someone who could find both of them again. The case of Troop 437 remains unique in the annals of true crime, a testament to the extraordinary lengths humans will go to conceal their actions, the remarkable resilience of the human spirit in the face of calculated erasure, and the enduring power of connection to transcend even the most sophisticated attempts at severing it. In the vast, indifferent beauty of the Yukon wilderness, human predators had weaponized nature itself as their alibi, but in the end, it was human determination that revealed the truth that the wilderness had silently witnessed all along.